What are your thoughts on Bitcoin and technology pushing for decentralization? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I like the idea of decentralized. I wouldn't say power, because again, I think that's the wrong way of construing the situation, because as soon as you think about decentralized power, then you've fallen into the clutches of those who think that power is the fundamental motivation. I really do think it's an unbelievably pathological presupposition, because what it presupposes is that, well, if everyone had their own choice, what they would choose is to compel others to do their will. And I don't believe that's true. I mean, I think it's true under some circumstances, but as I said before, I think that's only true when things degenerate. Because I don't think that we find our highest meaning in the compulsion of others to do our will. And I don't believe that we can find the meaning that sustains us in life by forcing others to grant our short-term wishes. I think that's an extraordinarily counterproductive way to live. And I think that the fact that psychopaths fail is evidence for that. Right? Psychopathy. Psychopaths are people who have the proclivity to use instrumental compulsion on others. For a psychopath, you're the source of whatever gratification can be extracted in the short term. And that looks like it's a more effective evolutionary strategy than laying at home semi-conscious in your bed, but it's certainly not effective enough so that it's the dominant human strategy, not by any stretch of the imagination. It's not even the dominant chimpanzee strategy. And so it isn't the distribution of power that's the advantage to decentralization. It's the distribution of destiny and responsibility. Now, I'll tell you one other thing about the story in Exodus, because there's another segment of that story that's extremely interesting. So when the Israelites are out in the desert, remember they've been slaves forever, and so they don't know how to organize themselves. They're fighting like mad. They have no idea how to mediate their own conflicts. And you see this in the modern world constantly, especially among people who are married, but within families as well. People are very bad at negotiating mediation. They have no idea how to do it. Why that is very complicated, but I think it's partly the desert and tyranny problem. It's hard to communicate with your partner, because if it turns out that you're wrong, which you often are, probably usually, and it means you have to give up something you believe to be true, and which wasn't, which is a bit of the tyrannical you, and then when you give that up, then you have to be in the desert for a while, and that's annoying. And so it's much easier just to tell everyone laughs because you all know that's absolutely true. Yeah, and that's partly why you have to be willing to die in order to come back to life too, right? Because you have to let go of those parts of you that are dead, or that should be dead, and then those parts have to die. And that's not nothing. And those parts fight to stay alive. And so Moses is out in the desert with the Israelites, and they're fighting away with each other, and they don't know how to negotiate, they don't know how to mediate their disputes. And so they come to Moses and they say, look, we're fighting all the time here. Do you want to tell us what to do? Do you want to judge us? And Moses says, yeah, I guess, okay. And so then he sets himself up as judge, and he judges the Israelites for like years, from morning till late at night. And his father-in-law, Jethro, shows up, and he's a figure that represents the archetype of the moral stranger. So he can see the enslaved Israelites squabbling away in the desert, and he can see Moses set himself up above them, and he can see that that's not so good. And so he goes to Moses and he says something like, you have to stop doing this. And Moses says, why? And Jethro says, well, first of all, it's too much responsibility. Nobody can do what you're doing and stay together. you're going to degenerate mentally and physically. It's too much burden. But worse, arguably, you're depriving your people of the responsibility of their own destiny. You're depriving them of the adventure of their life. You're depriving them of the necessity of their adventure. And you're setting yourself up as another Pharaoh. Because you can imagine the pharaonic situation, the tyrannical situation. It's like the Tower of Babel. There's a lot of disenchanted, fractionated individuals, and there's a tyrant. And that's all the structure there is. And that's just not any good. And all these disaffected individuals have no responsibility, and so all the responsibility is taken up by the tyrannical force, and then you have a huge gap between the tyrant and the disaffected individuals, and it's just a recipe for tyranny and slavery. It's a recipe for disaster. And so what Jethro says to Moses is, he says something like, you have to build an intermediary hierarchy, although those aren't the words that are used. And it turns out that we build those intermediary hierarchies in our own neural networks in an attempt to process the world properly. So this looks like a universal principle of proper apprehension and action. There has to be intermediary levels of processing. And so what Jethro tells Moses is, divide the Israelites into groups of 10 and have each 10 propose a leader. And then take the leaders and group them, and you have the leaders elect another leader, and then do that all the way up to groups of 10,000. And then have all the decisions made at as local a level as possible. And if the local hierarchies can't handle it, then you can make the final judgment. Otherwise, leave the people to their own devices, because they need the responsibility. And if you take on all that abdicated responsibility and destiny, then you'll just be another Pharaoh. And that's the principle of subsidiarity. That's the technical term. And the principle of subsidiarity is that decisions are best made at the lowest and most local level possible. And that looks like a universal principle. And Jonathan Pajot, who some of you know about, told me, yes, he's very smart, Jonathan Pajot. He told me in the Exodus seminar that that was the archetypal pattern for the idea of Mount Sinai. It's the archetypal pattern for the notion of proper governance. A distributed system of responsibility as opposed to absolute slavery. And it's opposed to absolute slavery, it's opposed to absolute tyranny, and it's also opposed to freedom without bounds. Because one of the other things that happens in Exodus is when God tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh to let his people go, which is what you always hear, it's a famous line, let my people go. That's not what God tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh. He says, let my people go so they may serve me in the wilderness. That's a whole different idea, because what it does is juxtapose against slavery ordered freedom, not borderless and boundless freedom. Because borderless and boundless freedom is just chaos, whereas ordered freedom is freedom according to a set of appropriate principles. And then the question is, well, what are the principles? And that's the same question as, what is the story that should guide you? In any case, the proper model of governance is something like a hierarchy of responsibility. And so one of the things that Tammy and I have been endeavoring to do as we travel from city to city, and I suppose what I'm doing right now, is to remind all of you of one thing, I suppose. If you abdicate your civic responsibility, then power-mad tyrants will vacuum it up and use it against you. Because someone's going to take that responsibility. And if it's not you, then it's going to be someone who wants to take that from you.